was interested in all of these things. And as it turns out, it was a much larger project than I could ever have imagined. And even now, 7 years later, I feel like I've barely gotten started. When I first began, though, I have to tell you a little just about myself so you'll know where I stood. I had always lived in the tropics or in the kind of tropical latitudes and had no experience of leaves changing color. I lived in either forests or jungles, and the leaves are always green. And if they're colorful, it's an ornamental type situation. So the first thing I did as kind of a way of thinking that I could study the trees was I thought, well, what if I went out this is in early October, when everything was still green, and cut a bunch of branches off all these different species of trees that are still green, and put them in my study. I thought then I could watch them change color and I could record it. So I took them, cut them off, put them in my study. And as I was observing them in my study, the leaves on the trees outside were changing color. And about maybe a month and a half later, the leaves from this particular tree looked like this. This is a branch from the same tree cut about a month later. So the leaves on the trees outside were turning all these beautiful colors. What were the leaves in my study doing? Any ideas?
Turn brown.
That was what I mean, I thought, okay, maybe they won't change colors, I'll get lucky, they'll just turn brown. But actually what they did was nothing at all.
Wow.
The leaves that I had cut earlier just stayed green. The leaves that I cut, the leaves outside were doing all kinds of wonderful things, but then turning brown and falling off. And the leaves that I cut and put in my study that were green stayed green for about 2 years. They never changed. They eventually just kind of broke apart, disintegrated, and turned a kind of very strange gray. And they all turned the same gray, even though on the trees, some went yellow, some went brown, some went red. So what I learned from the very simple experiment was just something that I hadn't considered, and that was that this death process was a process. It wasn't just something died, disintegrated, and fell off the tree, but something was happening, and it was happening only in the live tree, and it was expressing itself with color. So this was kind of the beginning of a questioning that I had, which followed on a question that I'd had before when I was studying minerals, and that was, do the colors that we see in nature have a significance? And I don't mean a symbolism, like red stands for power. I mean, is there a meaning? Why would it turn red? Why is this rock red? And is there a Goethean way to study this that might help me understand it better? So that was kind of how I entered into the study when I arrived in Dornbach. So over the years, over 7 years, I started just mostly observing at first. I did a lot of observing, not walking. Okay. Because I had never seen this phenomenon before. And I was very surprised I came with very few preconceived ideas, very, very few, but even the few that I came with were wrong. And one of the things I had no idea was every tree, I should say that every species changes colors differently. They change it differently depending on when they start. They change differently in the way they start and end. They change differently in the pattern that the color takes over the tree. They're different in how fast or slow it goes, and they're different in the range of colors that they show. So you'll have something like a maple. Well, let me start. There's a linden. We call it, I don't know if we have it. What do we have in the States? It's the same. Lindens?
Yeah, we do.
And those, I don't know if you know them, but they're the ones that are green, and they look like a jester at first, because only little patches turn yellow. And in Europe, where I was, that's the first tree to go. So you have several trees that look like little jesters. And they sit like that for quite a while before they turn all yellow, and then the leaves drop quite soon after that. Then you have something like a maple, which this middle one is more of the maple. And they would start at the top. The color change would start at the top, and it would flow down. To at a certain point, it looked like a lovely flame, because the bottom would be green, and then it would turn yellow, and at the tips it would be red. And then eventually the whole tree would turn, well, actually the whole tree never turned color. The leaves just started falling from the top down, and then the last leaves to go would turn color and top. And then you have your oak, which just takes the longest of all of them. It starts a little bit later than the rest, and it just has this very slow change of color where it goes maybe golden, and then eventually brown, and then the brown stays on the tree for a long time, maybe until winter, and then fall. So there's these very different ways that the tree is expressing whatever this process is that I'm working with. The other thing that I noticed was that the leaves themselves also are different. So some leaves change color from the outside going inwards. Some start on the inside and the color goes out. Some leaves, the whole leaf changes color altogether. Some, I don't know if you, how about I don't know about your maples over here, but over there they get kind of splotchy colored. And then you have some that you have in your hands, which you'll see. The beautiful red ones, and I have to think Judith should pick these for us so that we have some leaves to look at as well. Yes, the really pretty ones, and I don't know that tree, but in Europe we don't get so much red. There's not a lot of trees that go all the way to red. Most of them go to this beautiful yellow. So were I to walk outside and pick them for you there, you would have ended up with a lap full of yellow leaves. But regardless of what all the different trees did, this is going to sound very obvious, but it is an interesting question. They only changed 3 colors. Green was the original color, and you either got yellow, orange, or red, which in a kind of childlike way begs the question, why not purple and blue? And if you can imagine a landscape turning blue, you might know why it doesn't turn purple or blue, because that sounds horrible. But it is an interesting thought. It's just these 3 colors that we get. So one of the questions I get asked quite often is, what are the conditions under which this happens? So what do you guess? What are the conditions? We kind of know them. What are the conditions for the leaves to change color? Seasons, shortened daylight. Cold seems to have some effect. And recently, well, not recently, during my research, there was a lot of comment about humidity and whether it had been rainy in the spring or rainy in the summer or rainy in the fall seemed to have an effect. And as I studied it further, both through my observation, but also there was a lot of literature about this particular aspect. The change in daylight is kind of a trigger. And the timing of the change of leaves and color seems to coincide mostly with that. The intensity of the colors and which colors you get seems to have much more to do with warmth. So although the trees more or less were starting and ending around the same time, year after year, as I was observing over 7 or 8 years, there'd be years when they would all just kind of go brown quickly, or there'd be years when we go through the whole range of colors, or there'd be years when we go all the way to yellow, but then things kind of went brown, and that was about the end of it. And what we find is that the sun is kind of like the metronome, and the warmth is like the melody. And you have this beautiful interplay of colors based on these 2, the kind of interplay of time, as in light and darkness, and warmth. The other interesting thing, well, let me show the next slide. Let's look for a minute at what's happening in a tree. I just like using the pointer. I don't have one of these at home. So you have a leaf, you have the stem, and you see this little tiny bud, which always shows up between the leaf and the tree. And when it's at a certain stage, that's when this process, it coincides with this process happening. And what happens is as this point in time arrives, this change in light and darkness and the weather, there's a layer of cells just this side of that little bud that start to change. They start to grow differently. And eventually the very middle ones become quite hard, brittle, and so therefore separable. And then the ones on the outside towards the leaf end up being one kind and the one towards the tree another. And what happens when this, it's called an abscission layer, this layer of cells that forms. This thing that you see here is the main nutrient channel. It's the vein that goes up into the leaf from the tree. And as the abscission layer hardens, the vascular bundle gets more and more constricted. And so there's less and less transport of nutrients, water, whatever, back and forth from the leaf to the tree. And at some point, the hardness is enough that that more or less stops, and the abscission layer is brittle enough that you know you can barely touch the leaf in it. So then it flies up in the air. And if you try to pull a leaf off when it's still green, that's when you really see the difference. Try to yank a leaf off of a tree when it's green, and it won't come. But if the abscission layer is fairly formed, you can almost just blow on it and it flies away. So let's see what my next slide is. Yes. The activity that's happening at the more molecular level or the chemical level, the level of chemistry, is that over the growth of the leaf, the cells have been filled. They don't start out this way, but they fill with chlorophyll, which is your main component in photosynthesis, which is how the leaf is converting the sunlight to sugars. And as the vascular bundle constricts, the chlorophyll starts to do what we call degrade, which means it starts to break, it doesn't get replenished. Chlorophyll has a replenishing quality to it, and that all chlorophyll molecules just kind of keep getting rejuvenated. So they keep doing their job of converting sunlight to sugar. And as the vascular bundle hardens, the chlorophyll starts to degrade, and what it does is it breaks down into smaller compounds of different sugars. And the yellows that are then seen were there all along. They just were masked by the green, by the chlorophyll. So they are molecules of their pigments, I should say, that are in the leaf from the beginning. And as the green goes away, the yellow is still there. And then eventually the yellow also goes away, and then you see the browns. The red is an unusual occurrence. And I've read some places that misstate it. They say it was in the leaf all along and it's revealed, but it's not. The red only shows up under very specific conditions, and it's produced by the leaf in that moment. So it's a different kind of it's a different compound. They're called anthocyanins. If you know that word, it's something we talk about. They're in antioxidants, they're in blueberries, they're in ripening fruit. And they only show up in conditions where you have a certain extreme between cold and warm, like warm, and light, and you have light. So just like an apple will only turn red in the place that's in the sunlight, the leaf will only turn red in a place that gets sunlight. So that's one requirement, it has to be in sunlight. And the other requirement is this cold, warm, extreme. And that can happen in different ways. That can happen if your daylight, your daytime is quite warm because it's sunny, it's a sunny autumn, and your nighttime temperatures are very cold. You have this dramatic change for the leaf. Or you will notice it, you will have seen it whenever you get frost. If you notice after a frost, you'll start to see the oranges and the reds in your trees. Now here in North America, you see them much more in the same species that we have in Europe. It's the same exact species, but over here they will go much more red than they will in Europe. In Europe, they'll stay much more yellow. And I haven't quite figured that out, but I think there are more dramatic polarities between warmth and cold on our continent here that are somehow revealing themselves in this showing up of the red, because we just don't get a lot of red in Europe, just certain species. Oops. So that kind of gives you the, in a very, very small nutshell, a picture of what's going on. What intrigued me was, as I was noticing these things and learning these things and watching these trees, I observed something that wasn't in any of the scientific literature. And I realized that was because they weren't looking for it. But every occurrence of change of colors always follow the same sequence of colors. So you always started out with the green. Yellow always comes next. Orange always comes next. And red always comes last. And even if a tree skips one of those colors, it will still follow that sequence. Even if it doesn't go all the way to one of those colors, it will still follow the sequence. So this yellow to orange to red was always present. And
is that true of all species?
it was true of all the ones that I was observing that were changing colors in this way, where they were changing, all of them. And the only ones that might be slightly different are the ones that are red, and there's trees that are always red. Like
Japanese maple.
Like a Japanese maple. Those will be different. Then we have a blood beech, we call it in Europe. Those are a little bit different.
The burning bush here, it goes from green to sort of hot pinky red.
Mm-hmm.
It's true.
It does. It's never yellow.
Right. It will never go yellow or orange, but it won't go from that pinky red to yellow or orange.
No.
No. Red is always the final color that shows up in the sequence, even if it's the only color that shows up. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting, gladiolas, I believe, are a flower from last year's growth,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm not mistaken. And I think, although I don't remember exactly, but I think they also, because I have a huge crop of them, and I think that they go in the opposite way. They start with red and end with
As a flower.
As a flower,
Yes.
yeah.
But you can see the sequence, this
There's a
sequence means
sequence, yeah.
something. Yes,
Yeah.
it means something. And I found it in the landscape as well. When I studied these colors in valleys so that I could see the change in the color going up the hillside, and you could see that the trees at the bottom of the hill would be more yellow into orange, and then at the very top they would be in red. And then that color, if you're able, and I was so lucky to be where I was to observe these things, these beautiful valleys in the Alps, because the colors would be like waves, this wave of yellows, oranges, and reds, and then come back down and reds. And it was amazing. You could take the cable car up to the top and just watch it all along the valley. Go up, 5 days later, and it would have changed. Go up a day later, and it would have changed.
You know the reason. Good spirit is still.
Yes, absolutely. I go to Goethe's Valley.
So why would that, is that the altitude?
Yes, so you have this difference in altitude, which means you have a difference in temperature. And in a way, it's kind of gets colder higher first, and the cold kind of comes down. So the trees at the top are changing sooner than the trees at the bottom, which means they'll go yellow first, and then by the time the next set of trees are yellow, these are already turning orange. And then by the time the yellow gets to the bottom of the valley, the top ones are already red. So it's again, it's this warmth difference that's giving you the range of colors. The timing is related to both, but more to the time of year. Now, in order to really understand this, I thought I need to look at what happens in spring, because I want to see what happens when the leaves come out. And does this tell me anything about what happens when the leaves fall off? And that's a whole other long piece of my research, which I won't get into except for this. In the leaves in spring, you find the same three colors. You again find the red, the orange, and the yellow. But this time they're united with the green. They all show up at the same time. But they will show up more or less in the same order. And any of you who grows roses knows this. because your rose leaves, when they first come out, will be red. I'm sorry, they come in the opposite order. You get the reds first, and then you might see the orange, and you see a little bit of the orange, and then the yellow. They're harder to see because they're already with the green. So it's harder to realize that that's a color. If you do chromatography on the leaves, they'll separate out and you see it better. But those of you that grow roses know that your reds, your leaves come out red and they slowly change to the green. And what happens? The green starts in the middle of the leaf and kind of pushes the red to the edges. And then eventually, when we get to summer, no yellow, no red, no orange left in either direction. You just have this deep, almost tending towards bluish green, which all the leaves kind of eventually end up as. All right. So I started to really think, I know these colors, I know this sequence because I worked as an artist, and I knew about it from color palette. It's the warm colors on the artist palette, as opposed to the purples and the blues, which are the cool colors. And when you do color mixing, this is a sequence that you're familiar with. And I found, I was teaching classes at the Gertiana, and one of the things I would do in fall is we would walk the whole campus and look at trees. And I would tell them, as you're walking, just pick up leaves. And they would all come with a bundle of leaves. And then I would have the whole group, I'd say, just, okay, put the leaves on the ground, however you want, just make it pretty. I wouldn't give them any direct, just put your leaves on the ground with everybody else's leaves, but make it pretty. Every single time they did this, without exception. So it's a sequence that somehow feels right to us. It feels beautiful to us. It's kind of in us. A sidebar, a parallel to my leaf work at the Gertiana has been working with Johannes and Matthias, the physicists, on colors more in the area of the atmospheric colors and optics. And that has been, actually that was almost the clue that I needed to understand these colors in the leaves, which are colors in substance. Because when you can study the colors in optics, you can manipulate the colors. The only way to manipulate colors in substance is to work with pigments. So I could do some color mixing. And I did understand, yellow and red mixed together makes orange. That was fine. But when I started to work in optics, you find that this sequence also shows up in the atmosphere. And again, afterwards I always think, oh my God, how dumb am I? I never saw this. But I'm sitting one night watching the clouds. We have beautiful sunsets in Goa. Watching the clouds pass overhead as the sun is setting. And first, of course, they're white. And then they were just this gorgeous, glowing golden color. And then they turn to this amazing kind of rosy orange color. And then they turned red. And then they turned almost magenta. And then I went, oh my God, there's my sequence. And I never really thought about it, but you know what? The setting sun as it is, you'll see the sequence, yellow to orange to red. But even over time, as the sun was setting, that sequence was there as well. And of course, probably the most wonderful occurrence of it is in the rainbow.
Why is the inner background inside the rainbow that looks whiter than outside?
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it's always that way.
It's always that way. And you can't quite see it in this photograph, but if you could, between the double rainbow, it's darker here.
Right, than out there.
Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other, I don't know if I have time because I do want to keep us on schedule. But essentially, when you work with these colors, you can experiment with them using prisms. You can create these effects using prisms and using lenses and such. And you will see that what you are creating, I have a slide for it, but it's all the way at the end. is you have the red, orange, yellow sequence, and you have a blue, violet, blue, cyan sequence, and when they come together, you get the green in the middle. And the one sequence where red is on the edge is related to darkness, and the sequence where violet is on the edge is related to light. And I could go more into it, but I don't want to go too far off topic. However, what you've asked is exactly what I was starting to realize about this difference between, for example, why leaves would be red and why not blue. That these sequences of colors show us a relationship between light and darkness. When you play with the prisms, you find that it's the interplay of light and darkness through what we call a turbid medium, through the glass of the prism, that allows this effect to appear, these colors to show up. Where you only have like white and black, you can make colors appear by looking through a prism. And it depends on how you orient the light and darkness. And in my project, what I started to think about was, first I was thinking about the sunset, and I thought, isn't it interesting that the colors in the sky, we only really see at sunset and at dawn. You know, you don't see a colorful thing with the sun in the middle of the day, and certainly don't see it at night. And at dawn and at dusk are the two times of day when the atmosphere offers an opportunity for seeing a shift in light and darkness. Whether it's at the sunset, where we have the light of the sun here shining towards the darkness coming towards it, or dawn, where we have the light and the darkness is receding. And in both those situations where light and darkness are given an opportunity to interact, colors appear. And I thought this is somehow related to these colors that are appearing in the leaves. But I have to change my concept of light and darkness, because in the leaf it's not directly light and darkness, it has to do with matter and light. And I thought, isn't it interesting that the change of colors in the leaves also happens in spring and fall, where we have a great shift in light and darkness, because we have either our days are getting longer much quicker, or they're getting shorter much quicker. And the points at which these two things happen are kind of at the extremes of that shift, where that's happening quite quickly. So I want to kind of wrap it up, because I want to stay on time, but I wanted to bring something that relates to our topic, which has to do with the climate. And that is that this shift between light and darkness is something that happens only in the temperate zones. If you're in the polar zone, it's kind of dark all year and then it's light. And there's not a spring and summer, could be like a couple days. You don't have this transition between light and darkness there. On the equator, where I grew up, you know, sun rises at 6 and sets at 6 every day. There's nothing that changes. And only in the temperate zone, which is these red ones, do we have this big shift. And with the exception of these few places in the southern hemisphere, the reds on here are where we have deciduous forests. It's the location of deciduous forests. And deciduous trees are the ones that drop all their leaves. So I didn't mention this condition earlier because I wanted to bring it at the end, that one of the conditions for the leaves to change color is that it has to be a tree that's a deciduous tree that drops all of its leaves. And it has to drop all of its leaves at the same time. So for example, a pine tree, it's like my cat, it sheds all year, right? And some of the trees where I live in the semi-tropics shed sequentially, like the leaves on the tree will fall off, but there's already new leaves there, and then the old leaves fall, and new leaves come, and the old leaves fall. So there's a succession of dropping leaves. But only deciduous trees at some point drop all of them. And only in the temperate zones do they change color. So it's actually very rare what you get to see here. Where you are here and here, we see it in Europe, and a little a much smaller region than this in China, are the only places where we get this beautiful fall change of colors. So the next step in my project, in a way, is to take this into not so much what's going to happen when climate changes. I already know what's going to happen. I mean, if climate changes, we already are seeing the leaves are starting to come out earlier, they're starting to stop earlier, so the timing will change because the warmth is changing. The intensity of the colors will change, but that will be in the moment. That's not going to be the big effect. The big effect will be the timing. And that also would mean that our deciduous trees are moving to new places. But I've had a thought as I've worked with this, that perhaps through my understanding of the colors themselves, people now ask me, well, why are leaves green? I said, well, once you study the colors enough, and if I had given you a lecture on green, I could point this out easier. Green is the only, it's the only right color for them. It's the only color that makes sense as a color for a leaf to be what it is, with what it does, which is this regenerating, balancing light and matter process in order to produce sugars. Green is the color that expresses that. And red does have this very kind of strong, if you're in a room that's red, you really can feel it. If you approach red with your soul, there's a very strong quality to red that has a kind of standing firm quality to it. And I think of it as the trees are saying, I got this process I gotta do. I gotta get these nutrients out back into the tree before I fall off. And wait a minute, you just got too cold too quick. I'm not going yet. Red. And the tree is literally doing that in the sense that at that point when the leaves turn red, they actually get stronger again. Or when they were turning yellow, the vascular lining was making them weaker, and they would be much more susceptible to falling off. When they turn red, they actually gain strength again. They're harder to pull off. They're more resistant to any kind of rupture or disease. And I just have this sense that this red is kind of a, hey, I'm not done yet. And I've been wondering if the color change that we're seeing, although we find it beautiful, is actually already an expression of a shift that's pushing trees beyond where they're meant to be. That it's not necessarily always natural for these trees to be changing these colors, even though it's we love the phenomenon and it's quite beautiful. So I think that climate change will, of course, affect it. And one of the questions that I'll take also into my future research is these different colors have different capacities for absorbing heat and radiating light. And that will change also the entire environment around them if we change the way the colors are. So I want to leave you with this lovely quote from Steiner. I'll let you read it. Can you read it? No, let me read it. All right, I'll read it to you in just one second then, because I want to say one thing. Somehow in my life, it's such a beautiful thing. I always, for some reason, get asked to give this presentation at this time of year. It's always an accident. Half the time I don't plan it. But it's such a perfect, of course, it changes seasons anyway. But there's this lovely quote from Steiner who says, "To be able to perceive how, with the yellowing of the leaves, there is a descent of the springing, sprouting life, but how the sensible becomes yellow in order that the spiritual can live in the yellowing. To be able to perceive how, in the falling of the leaves, the ascent of the spirit takes place, how the spiritual is the counter manifestation of the fading sense perceptible. This should be as a perceptive feeling for the spirit. This should be as a perceptive feeling for the spirit and soul the human being in autumn. Then he prepares himself in the right way for the coming of Christmas." And I thought that's lovely. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.